Do you know what it feels like to hear something you were never supposed to hear? Not gossip, not rumor, but a truth, a living thing that writhes the moment it touches your ears, that changes the way you see your own reflection. Tonight, you're going to hear one of those truths, and once you do, you'll never look at the Appalachian Mountains the same way again. There are families up there, not names you'll find in any census, not bloodlines in any heraldry. These were the hidden dynasties of the hills. They didn't just survive. They ruled the shadows, some with knives, some with silence, and some with powers we still don't dare put into words. When outsiders tried to erase them, the mountains swallowed the records, the fires consumed the paper, and the whispers turned into warnings. But here's the secret no one wants spoken. They're not gone. They never left. The Appalachians are full of ghosts that never died, families that never ended, men who walked into town in daylight but cast shadows too long for human bodies, women who nursed infants that didn't cry, who never blinked, who seemed to stare past the world into something the rest of us weren't built to see. The government pretends these were folk tales. The church calls them fictions, but in private archives, in burnt county records and sealed journals, their names surface again and again. Families who lived by laws no outsider could survive. Families so feared that no sheriff, no preacher, no census taker dared climb the ridge after sundown. Families that killed not out of anger but out of doctrine. You've heard of Feuds, the Hatfields and McCoys, backwoods revenge, shotguns in the dark. But that's a carnival sideshow compared to the truth. Those were just men spilling blood over fences and cattle. What we're talking about tonight, these Appalachian dynasties, is something else entirely. It wasn't revenge, it was control. Psychological systems of silence, obedience, ritual. Some were cults, some were clans, some were something older, stranger. Families that didn't just inherit land, but inherited darkness. And what makes them different, what makes them dangerous, is that they didn't want attention. They didn't posture. They didn't send letters to newspapers boasting of their kills. No, these families thrived because they erased themselves. They hid behind fog, behind superstition, behind the silence of neighbors who understood what it meant to stay alive. That silence was the leash, the first control system, and it still works today. Think about it. The mountains stretch on for hundreds of miles, ridges folding into valleys where light barely cuts through. Whole towns have vanished there, rail stations abandoned overnight, schoolhouses left with chalk still on the slate, meals still on the tables. You don't hear about those places because the silence keeps them buried. Every map is edited, every record is smudged, every sheriff who came close ended up missing or mad. These families, the Marrowbones, the Fletchers, the Dredges, the Bellwethers, and others you'll meet tonight, weren't just violent. They were deliberate. They operated like organisms, feeding off the fear and weakness of the outsiders who brushed too close. They practiced rituals to bind themselves tighter than law, tighter than blood. The mountains gave them cover, and the silence of the people around them gave them power. And here's the piece that matters to you. Control doesn't always come from crowns or offices or banks. Sometimes it comes from a family no one has seen in daylight. Sometimes it comes from a ritual whispered in barns with no windows. Sometimes it comes from a child who doesn't blink when he stares into you, who pays with a coin drilled with 3 holes and never speaks your name again. Do you see it now? The story of Appalachia isn't just about poor miners, moonshiners, or frontiersmen. That's the surface. That's the cover they let you keep. Underneath is the shadow economy. Not of money, but of blood, silence, and obedience. And for 200 years that system worked. It still works. Because the silence is intact. Because men like me don't speak. And men like you don't listen. Until tonight. When the first sheriff vanished, when his badge arrived sealed in a jar of blood, the newspapers tried to laugh it off, called it hillbilly superstition. But the truth was clear to anyone who had the courage to read the handwriting. The families were warning the outsiders, you do not own these hills, we do, and if you push, you vanish. That's why whole trails disappear from county maps, why houses burn from the inside with no bodies recovered, why firemen find chairs still warm but no people in them. The families don't fight wars. They erase witnesses, they thin bloodlines until no one is left to tell the story. But the paper always survives. That's why I can tell you this now, not from memory, not from hearsay, but from words written by men who paid with their lives for the mistake of looking too deep. Their notes survived, their journals buried in trunks, their records hidden in church attics and courthouse vaults, and every page whispers the same warning. The families aren't myths. The families are the lore of these mountains, and now you're going to meet them. Each one deadlier than the last, each one darker, older, more forbidden. These aren't the stories that make it into classrooms or documentaries. These are the files they tried to seal, the testimonies they tried to burn, the truths they buried under silence. But silence has a way of breaking, and tonight, I'm going to break it. So lean closer, because once you hear the first name, you've already crossed the threshold, and there is no walking back. The first name whispered in those sealed ledgers is the one that even other mountain folk refused to say aloud. The Marrowbones, a family whose very silence became a weapon. Their story begins on a ridge above Hollow Bend, where the forest folds in on itself like a hand trying to hide something. They arrived around 1817, though no one saw them arrive. That's how it always is with infestations. You never see the first one. By the time you notice, the roots have already spread. Census takers stopped climbing to their cabin after 1840. Post riders pretended the trail didn't exist. Children were warned not to wander uphill. And soon the Marrowbones were erased from maps altogether, as if the land itself had chosen to deny them. But the absence wasn't emptiness. No, absence was their presence. No dogs barking, no smoke rising, even in winter. Just stillness, an unnatural stillness that clung to their ridge like rot clings to the root of a tree. Their home stood like an insult to the mountain. 2 stories. No windows on the north side, a slate roof that never leaked despite endless rain. Behind it, a shed with no doors, no handles, no hinges, just a wall of wood locals called the Watching Shed. But it was the attic that haunted men into their graves. A deputy named Silas Crowder claimed he looked through a crack in the slats one night in 1879. What he saw ended him. He lived long enough to write it down, but not long enough to outrun it. 3 chairs, arranged in a semicircle. In each chair, a corpse, mummified, still dressed in wedding clothes, mouths stitched shut with fishing line. A 4th chair sat empty, facing them. Crowder hanged himself 2 winters later, leaving behind only a single note scrawled across his wall in charcoal. They listen better than we do. The Marrowbones had their rituals. They believed death wasn't separation but amplification, that a body buried was a spirit silenced. But a body preserved, stitched, seated, kept upright, was protection, guardianship. A house full of corpses was a fortress, not a tomb. That was their law. That was their silence. And silence was the currency they demanded from Hollow Bend. No lawman dared walk up their ridge. No preacher dared knock on their door. People disappeared. Children strayed too far. A teacher sent in 1871 vanished after 4 days. The only trace was her slate, dangling from a tree branch, etched with a single word, listen. That was their game. Silence wasn't absence, it was an instruction, an obedience, and Hollow Bend obeyed. The Marrowbones did not eat like other families. Garden plots barely scratched the earth. Game traps always full, though hunters claimed no deer had roamed those hills in years. Survivors said they ate less than a man should, more than an animal ought to. Their sustenance was something else, ritual, consumption of the unseen, bloodlines carried in jars and bowls. A physician's journal found in a burned church box described seeing the eldest son walking barefoot in frost, humming a sound like furniture moving beneath the floor. No child of theirs ever attended school. None were baptized, none were recorded. When one girl, Mina or Minna, depending on which record you read, came to town at age 10, she bought white thread and kerosene, paid with a silver coin drilled through the face. The shopkeeper said she never blinked once. She smelled of basements, she said. Basements no one had ever found. And always there was the rumor of a cellar, a 3rd door, a door beneath the roots. Bootleggers who stumbled too close spoke of doors that weren't real, of voices telling them to turn back. Some returned sobbing, barefoot, broken. Some never returned at all. By 1903, winter thinned the family. Epidemic burned through the ridge. But not all died. Survivors burrowed deeper. Witnesses said they were seen long after, pale children watching surveyors from the tree line. 3 chairs in clearings still warm as if someone had just risen. No photographs survive, no documents remain intact. Every attempt to write them down smudges, fades, disappears. Their existence itself resists record, and yet one note from Sheriff Elias Penley survived. October 12, 1882. His words: "The bones are still talking. I hear them every time the wind comes from the ridge." Days later, his journal entry was slashed out with charcoal. One word written beneath it: sealed. Do you understand the weight of that? A sheriff's final entry, censored not by government, but by something deeper. A word written not to archive, but to close. Sealed. The way you seal a jar. The way you seal a wound. The way you seal a mouth. The marrow bones were not a family. They were a control system, a dynasty of silence. They thrived not because they fought, but because they erased. They weaponized absence. They turned their neighbors into accomplices, and that is why their memory still lingers, not as history, but as obedience. When you drive through Appalachia today, past towns with no lights, past churches with no glass, past houses with chairs on porches but no people, you'll feel it. That's silence. That is their inheritance. And if you dare break it, if you dare speak their name too loud, you'll feel it press back. Because silence is not empty. Silence listens. Silence waits. The Marrowbones taught that, and the other families learned from them. This is just the beginning. One family, one ridge, a whisper sealed under charcoal. But if you think the Marrowbones were the worst, you're wrong. They were only the first. The silence is broken now. The next name waits. The next name written in those lost ledgers is one most men have never heard. The Fletchers of Fog Hollow, a family whose entire existence revolved around erasure, not just of themselves, but of the very concept of reflection. Fog Hollow itself no longer appears on maps. Ask a surveyor, and he'll tell you the terrain doesn't match its own records. Roads bend into nothing, creeks vanish underground, whole coordinates fail to align. But in the 1800s, the hollow was marked, and in that hollow lived the Fletchers. Their land was claimed in 1850, a simple deed, 37 acres of woodland. That's the last time their name was written in official record. No taxes paid, no births recorded, no deaths acknowledged. After 1850, the Fletchers ceased to exist in government eyes, yet in reality, they multiplied. The hollow grew louder with them. Their home was described by one trespasser as uniform, unnatural. Black pine boards, tight seams, every shutter nailed shut. Not a single window cut into the walls. Not one. The house was sealed like a tomb, but from the inside. Neighbors said no chimney smoke rose in winter, no lanterns glowed in summer, and yet travelers saw a strange light shimmering in the soil itself, glowing from the ground like embers of a buried fire. Some said it was fungus, some said gas, but others, those who lived long enough to write, claimed it was something else. A radiance, not of fire, not of earth, but of eyes. What terrified the neighbors most was not the silence, but the mirrors, or rather, the lack of them. The Fletchers outlawed reflection. One postal work, Amos Candler, stumbled into their land in 1874 with a misdelivered parcel. A boy met him at the door, no older than 12. His skin was pale as salt, his pupils wide as coins, his chest etched with glyphs in an alphabet no scholar has ever identified. Candler, nervous, held up a small hand mirror, offering it in barter for directions. The boy recoiled. His words: "The glass eats your face." That was the Fletcher law. Reflections consume. Mirrors devour. To catch your own image was to lose yourself to something hungry and patient. No Fletcher was ever seen to look into glass. No water basins reflected their eyes. No polished steel was allowed to remain. They lived in a world without their own faces. The Fletchers starved themselves too. They practiced fasting not by days but by lunar phases. They ate only on odd nights. Children walked with ribs protruding. Elders with lips sewn shut at dawn to prevent speech before sunset. Their doctrine demanded silence during the day. Silence so absolute some swore you could hear their bones grinding when they moved. One merchant passing through the hollow in 1886 reported seeing 3 Fletcher boys standing barefoot in a creek in winter, arms raised, heads shaved, mouths open. Their tongues were blackened with ink, carved with lines like writing. The merchant said they turned in perfect unison, opened their mouths wider, and exhaled steam that froze in the air like script before vanishing. He never went back. Were they a sect, a cult, or something older? Some historians believe the Fletchers were descendants of an ancient penitential order hiding in America after exile. Others claim they were simply madmen bound by superstition. But if they were only mad, explain what happened on February the 13th, 1908. On that morning, smoke rose from the ridge, a fire so quick and controlled it consumed the Fletcher home in minutes. Witnesses swore the flames moved inward, collapsing the structure like it was devouring itself. No bodies were recovered, not one. The only object left intact was a heavy iron door, unhinged, etched with the number 44 and an inverted star. That door was placed into evidence and later vanished from county storage without explanation. 3 days after the fire, Sheriff Harlan Day found a root cellar beneath the ashes. Inside were 15 chairs carved with letters of the alphabet, none repeating, arranged in a crescent. In the center, a pile of black cloth still warm to the touch despite the snow. His last journal entry reads, "The house had no windows, but something saw us anyway." He died less than a year later. The remaining pages of his notes were stolen, leaving only that line. By 1910, the Fletcher name was purged from county rolls. No census, no taxes, no birth or death certificates. It was as if the family had never existed. Only one survivor's name appears in later archives, Warren Fletcher, a boy who appeared in a reform school in 1933. He lasted 2 weeks before vanishing. His mattress was found torn open from the inside. The only clue, a note written in perfect reverse cursive. "They can't burn what was never lit." What does it mean? Was it defiance or admission that the Fletchers themselves were never flesh to begin with, but something else? Neighbors whispered the Fletchers had bargained with forces older than the land, that they gave up food, speech and reflection in exchange for survival, and that when the fire came, it wasn't destruction, but migration, a shedding of the shell, a return underground. If you walk through those hills today, hunters swear you can still feel it. The silence, the absence of reflection in still water, the way your own face looks wrong when the fog rolls in. Fog Hollow is no longer on maps, but that doesn't mean it's gone. The Fletchers erased themselves from paper, but erasure is not the same as death, and maybe that's the lesson. That's what they want remembered. If you can't see yourself, you can't be destroyed. If you can't be recorded, you can't be erased. If you give up your reflection, you give up your weakness. The Marrowbones mastered silence, the Fletchers mastered absence, and what's left in their wake is worse than memory. It's a gap, a hollow, and hollows are never empty, because something always fills them, and if you look too long into Fog Hollow, what fills it is you. The next family etched into the Appalachian night were called the Dredges of Blackroot Ridge. Their name, even spoken aloud, carried a weight. Locals swore it pulled at the air like a wound trying to breathe. If the Marrowbones represented silence and the Fletchers represented absence, then the Dredges embodied only one thing: hunger. Blackroot Ridge was an unforgiving place. The soil was chalky, the trees stunted and black-veined, and the river that ran through it had a red tint every spring, as if something beneath the ground bled out during the thaw. It was here that the Dredges appeared. No one knew from where. They didn't buy the land, didn't claim a deed, didn't even introduce themselves. Their cabin simply appeared one year, nailed together out of scavenged boards, sitting on stilts like a rotting altar, and with it the family. The Dredges were not farmers, nor hunters, nor craftsmen. They worked no land and traded no goods, yet somehow they survived. Their faces were long and sharp, their skin grey as limestone, and their eyes too wide. One woman, Eliza Trent, wrote in her diary after glimpsing them, "They look like men stretched thin until the soul leaks out." Children whispered that the Dredges drank the river, that they went out at night to kneel at its banks and scoop the red water into their mouths until it ran down their chins. No one dared confront them, not even the church, but the truth was far worse than rumor. By 1867, livestock began vanishing from nearby farms. Whole herds of goats disappeared without a single track left behind. When a boy stumbled home late one night, babbling about a skinny man drinking from a cow's throat, the elders dismissed him. But the very next morning, his family's pigs were found dead, not eaten, not butchered, but bled dry, their flesh untouched, their bodies lighter than straw. The Dredges denied nothing. They rarely spoke at all. But what sealed their reputation wasn't the missing animals. It was the altar. Travelers who crossed the ridge reported seeing it in the tree line, a platform of stone slabs arranged in a spiral, soaked so dark it glistened even in moonlight. No one ever dared to approach too close, but some swore they saw bones stacked at its base, not animal bones, human. The dredges held rituals there, always at the new moon. Lanterns flickering, voices droning in tones so low they rattled the ribs. Some swore they carved themselves with knives of flint, dripping blood into jars and raising them high before pouring it into the soil. Others claimed they buried the jars beneath the roots, as if feeding something beneath, something old. A miner named Francis Bell wrote a report to the county in 1872 after stumbling across one of their gatherings. There were 9 of them. They were kneeling, each with their wrists open. They bled in silence. Not one cried. When the jar was full, they sealed it with ash. When they lowered it into the hole, the earth trembled like a heart. I swear it to God. The ground breathed. Francis disappeared 3 weeks later. His last possession found was a boot, half sunk in the mud near Blackroot Ridge. Then came the children. Between 1875 and 1882, 7 children from nearby towns vanished, some while walking to school, others from their very beds. Doors left wide open, no sign of struggle. Only one body was ever found, a boy named Jonathan. His corpse was discovered deep in the ridge, laid carefully across stones. His chest was opened, but his heart was missing. In its place, a jar filled with soil. The sheriff at the time, David Harper, tried to rally men to burn the ridge, but those who volunteered never made it to the trees. One broke his leg, another went blind overnight, and the third simply vanished on the trail. Harper himself was found months later with his throat torn open, but not a drop of blood on the ground. His body was pale, dry, as if drained in one long exhale. By the 1890s, the dredges were a legend, a nightmare. Parents threatened their children, misbehave, and the dredges were ill come. And yet, the family endured. They were seen less often, yes, their house shuttered, their movements rare, but sightings still came. A pale woman on the ridge carrying a jar, a boy with teeth too sharp standing barefoot in the frost, a man humming through his nose while dragging a sack across the riverbank. No one dared confront them again, not after the final fire. In 1902, smoke was seen rising from Blackroot Ridge, a fire so black it seemed to choke the stars. Locals approached only after it was too late. The dredge cabin was gone. The ground beneath it collapsed into a pit so deep no torch could find its bottom. At the center, the altar, cracked in two, bleeding water like a wound. No bodies were found, not even ash. Only the smell, a sweet metallic stench that made men gag and horses bolt. The ridge was abandoned after that. Farmers refused to plant within sight of it. Miners sealed their shafts. Even the church scrubbed its records, but the hunger never left. Hunters still whisper of deer found gutted, their bodies emptied of blood. Hikers still vanish near the ridge, their packs discovered miles away with the straps cut clean. And every spring, the river still runs red. Were the dredges human, or had they already become something else? Some believe they were a family cursed with an insatiable thirst. Others say they were priests, chosen vessels to feed something sleeping in the soil. But the most disturbing theory is the simplest, that they were not worshippers at all, but the very thing being worshipped. Maybe the altar wasn't theirs, maybe it was theirs, and the dredges were just keeping it fed. What we know is this: the dredges of Blackroot Ridge disappeared, but their rituals didn't. Blood still vanishes from the land. Soil still drinks what it shouldn't. And if you stand too long on the ridge on a moonless night, some say you'll hear it. A sound in the dirt. Not a voice, not a breath, a heartbeat. And if you listen too close, you'll find your own heart begins to match it. The Ashworths of Widow's Creek were not feared because of what they did to others, but because of what they refused to let go of. While the Marrowbones vanished, the Fletchers erased, and the dredges fed the Ashworths preserved. Widow's Creek was a small, half-forgotten valley cut by a sluggish black stream. Fog gathered there even on clear days, and the soil carried a sour smell, like turned milk. The Ashworths lived in a rambling clapboard house at the farthest end, a house lined wall to wall with shuttered windows and a porch that sagged under its own weight. Nobody remembered when they arrived, only that they were always there, as constant as the fog. The Ashworth Patriarch by Elijah Ashworth was a carpenter by trade, but his true craft was not in building, it was in keeping, for Elijah had an obsession with faces. When someone died in the valley, Elijah would visit the home, offering his services free of charge. While others built coffins, Elijah brought plaster. He pressed it against the still faces of the newly dead, smoothing it carefully, whispering as he worked, and when it hardened, he carried the mask back to Widow's Creek. The neighbors assumed he kept them as memorials, tributes to those lost. But by 1871, whispers spread that Elijah had covered his entire parlor wall with these plaster faces. Row after row, shelf after shelf, every expression caught mid-death. Some mouths were open as if still gasping, others pursed, others twisted in fear. Children who peeked through the cracked shutters claimed to see eyes behind the masks, glinting as if watching. Elijah's children inherited his obsession. Each generation of Ashworths added to the collection, refining the craft. They no longer waited for neighbors to die. Instead, they sought out the newly buried, digging shallow graves in the dead of night to peel away what they wanted before the rot set in. Some claimed they had a formula, a mix of wax, ash, and bone dust that could keep the masks warm to the touch, supple like skin. But the most disturbing piece of the Ashworth ritual was not the mask itself. It was the ritual of wearing. Locals swore that when the moon was low and the creek's fog rose, the Ashworths gathered in their parlor. Each selected a mask from the wall and pressed it over their own face, binding it with a black cord tied at the back of the skull. They stood in silence, staring into mirrors, their breaths rattling through plaster teeth, and then, in a voice not quite their own, they began to speak. Witnesses described it as ventriloquy, but far too perfect. Deadwood Hollow was a gash in the Appalachian hills where nothing grew quite right. The trees twisted as if in pain, their bark mottled grey, and the ground was so rocky that crops withered after a season. The hollow seemed cursed, and perhaps it was, for it became the chosen seat of the Crowley clan. The Crowleys had money when few others did. Where that money came from was never clear. Some said bootlegging, others whispered of black mining contracts signed in blood. Whatever the truth, the Crowleys lived above the hollow in a 3-story mansion of black timber and stone, looming over the valley like a sentinel. They ruled not by law, but by fear. At the head of the family stood Absalom Crowley, a man described as tall, skeletal, and sharp-eyed, with a voice like gravel grinding. Absalom believed power was not earned, it was taken, and to take it fully, one needed more than land, more than gold. One needed a covenant with the bones beneath the earth. The Crowleys began building shrines. At first they resembled crude cairns, stones stacked in the woods, marked with animal skulls. But over time, these shrines grew into elaborate constructions. Deer spines wound into arches, ribs lashed into lattices, skulls arranged into pyramids. Hunters would return to the forest and find their kills missing, gutted, stripped, displayed in Crowley formations. But animals were only the beginning. By the winter of 1869, travelers reported human remains among the bone shrines. Femurs carved with symbols, skulls hollowed into chalices, jawbones tied like wind chimes. The Crowleys denied involvement, but the valley knew. Graves were dug up, families torn apart, children vanished on their way to school, and every time a disappearance rippled through Deadwood Hollow, a new shrine appeared, larger than the last. Locals swore the Crowleys gathered at these structures under moonlight, drow, said in black veils and red sashes, chanting in a language no one recognized. Their torches lit the hollow in flickers, shadows of bone shrines stretching across the ground like skeletal fingers. And always, the shrines grew warm when the rituals began, as if life itself had been coaxed back into the marrow. The Ashworth wearing the mask did not speak in their own voice. They spoke in the voice of the dead. Inflections, laughs, whispers, even private secrets no one else could have known spilled from their mouths. The family believed, no, they knew, that the masks did not just preserve the face, but the soul itself. By 1889, no funeral in the county was complete without an Ashworth appearance. The grieving families feared to refuse them, and many secretly wished for it. For when Elijah's descendants donned the mask, they didn't just speak, they answered. Mothers wept as their dead sons begged them not to mourn. Husbands clutched their living wives as the voices of their late wives whispered forgiveness. But there was always a cost. Each time the Ashworths spoke for the dead, something stayed behind. Witnesses claimed to hear faint echoes long after the ritual, whispers lingering in hallways, laughter curling under doors. One boy swore his father's mask spoke without anyone wearing it, its mouth twitching when the house grew cold. Then came the incident of 1903. A young girl named Clara went missing near Widow's Creek. Her body was never found. Weeks later, her mother was summoned to the Ashworth parlor. There, hanging among the plaster faces, was Clara's mask. Her lips parted, her eyes weeping plaster tears. And when one of the Ashworth daughters pressed it over her own face, Clara's voice pleaded from beneath, "Mama, help me. They won't let me leave." The mother collapsed, screaming, and by morning she had vanished too. Some swore they saw her in the valley weeks later, barefoot and silent, her face pale as wax. After that, suspicion hardened into terror. Farmers armed themselves, swearing to end the Ashworth line. But when they stormed the house, they found it empty. The parlor was intact, every mask still on the wall, but the family was gone. The only sign of the Aya departure was the dining room table, still set for supper, and at each plate sat a mask, not hanging, not mounted, but propped in chairs as if waiting. The house decayed, the porch sagging until it collapsed. But the masks remained. Explorers who dared enter the ruin claimed the faces were still there, lining the walls, untouched by dust or mold. Some insisted the masks moved, shifting a fraction each time you turned away, their eyes following. One traveler swore that when he touched the plaster, it pulsed with warmth, as if blood still ran beneath. Widow's Creek has remained largely abandoned. The stream still flows black, and animals refuse to drink from it. Those who camp nearby report voices in the fog, not cries but conversations. A mother scolding a child, a man humming a hymn, a girl calling for help. The legend endures. The Ashworths never left. They simply changed form, masks upon masks, waiting. Locals whisper that if you lose someone and dare to enter the creek at night, the Ashworths will find you. They will offer you the mask of your beloved. They will let you hear their voice one last time. And if you put it on, even for a moment, you'll never take it off again. Because the Ashworths don't just preserve faces, they preserve souls, and every new mask needs a wearer. If the Ashworths of Widow's Creek were obsessed with preserving the dead, the Crowleys of Deadwood Hollow were obsessed with using them. What made the Crowleys truly feared, though, was the way misfortune seemed to follow anyone who defied them. A farmer who refused to pay tribute lost his herd overnight, their bones left in a perfect spiral outside his barn. A preacher who condemned them from the pulpit was found dead weeks later. No wounds, no blood, just every bone in his body shattered inward, as though he'd been crushed from the inside. His skeleton, neighbors whispered, appeared days later in a new Crowley shrine, grinning from its hollow sockets. The Crowleys did not simply display bones, they wielded them. By the early 1900s, entire sections of Deadwood Hollow became off-limits. No one dared cut timber where the Crowleys had planted shrines, for those who did often disappeared before sundown. The family mansion itself was said to be filled with bones, banisters made of femurs, chandeliers strung with finger bones, a dining table whose legs were human tibias polished to gleaming white. But the most disturbing part of the Crowley estate was the Bone Hall. Visitors described it as a cathedral of death. Hundreds of skulls lined the walls, stacked in neat rows from floor to ceiling. The floor itself was tiled with vertebrae, each piece fused with tar, crunching underfoot like brittle shells. And in the center of the hall stood a throne, not carved of wood or stone, but constructed entirely of bones. Long femurs shaped the back, rib cages formed the armrests, and a pair of human skulls sat where hands might rest. Absalom Crowley called it the seat of dominion. He believed that sitting upon it allowed him to hear the voices of those who came before, every soul bound to the bones, whispering secrets of power. Neighbors who caught glimpses swore they heard voices seeping from the hall at night, hundreds speaking at once, some begging, some laughing, some shrieking. When Absalom died in 1911, his eldest son Silas inherited the throne. The transition was not peaceful. Each Crowley child demanded the right to rule, and within days the hollow became a battlefield. Shotgun blasts echoed through the woods, fires lit the ridge, and neighbors swore they saw figures moving with unnatural speed through the trees. Crowleys draped in bone charms, shrieking as if possessed. By the time the smoke cleared, Only Silas remained. Every sibling was dead, and in the bone hall, new shrines had been raised. Each sibling's remains worked into the structure, immortalized as part of the throne. Silas ruled longer than his father, but he ruled darker. Under Silas, the Crowleys began demanding tributes. Every family in the Hollow was forced to deliver one offering a year, an animal at minimum, but often something more. Rumors spread that Silas preferred children, for their bones are unbroken, their marrow unspoiled. Farmers locked their doors, churches rang their bells deep into the night, but still the Hollow's children disappeared. The Crowleys' power swelled until 1928, when a posse of armed men from neighboring counties stormed the mansion. They claimed they would end the dynasty once and for all, but when they entered they found no one. The Crowleys were gone. The Bone Hall, however, remained. What the posse described was beyond comprehension. The throne still sat in the center, but it was no longer a simple construction. It had grown. Bones jutted from the floor, the walls, the ceiling, all fused together like coral reef, forming a monstrous, writhing structure. The men swore the bones shifted as they watched, like the hall itself was alive. Some swore they saw faces in the skulls, eyes flickering with trapped souls. One man swore he heard his dead brother calling his name from inside the walls. Terrified, the posse set fire to the mansion. For 3 days it burned, smoke choking the Hollow. When the embers cooled, the house was gone, but the hill where it had stood remained barren. No trees, no grass, no wildlife. And still today, nearly a century later, the land refuses to heal. Travelers who camp there claim to wake surrounded by bones that weren't there before. Teeth scattered in circles, ribs stabbed into the dirt like stakes. Some say that on certain nights, when the fog rolls down into Deadwood Hollow, you can hear the bones rattling, clattering together like wind chimes. And if you stay long enough, you'll hear voices too, hundreds at once, whispering in unison, "Join us." The legend of the Crowleys endures because of one final rumor. They were never destroyed. The fire, the posse, the blood feud. It was all part of a ritual. The Crowleys gave themselves to the Bone Hall, binding their souls into the structure, and though the mansion is gone, the Bone Hall remains. Not made of wood, not made of stone, but made of them. The Crowleys ruled with bones and shrines, but deep in the Blood Veil, power took another form, something subtler, but no less deadly. The Vandergast sisters were unlike any family the mountains had seen before. Where the Ashworths and Crowleys lived in isolation, drawing outsiders only by fear, the Vandergasts invited people in. They dressed finely, spoke eloquently, and appeared in town markets with smiles and sweet words. And yet, wherever they went, ruin followed. They were 3. Eliza, the eldest, with raven black hair streaked with silver, said to speak with the dead. Margaret, the middle, with eyes pale as frost, who wove charms into her sewing and hexes into her lace. Clara, the youngest, red-haired and freckled, who could sway men with a glance and make women sick with envy. Together they became known as the Weavers of Bloodvale. The Bloodvale itself was a strange region. The soil there was too red, the rivers too thick, as if iron itself bled from the land. Crops that grew there were rich but often twisted, tomatoes bursting too large, corn bending into unnatural spirals. Locals swore the valley was poisoned, cursed from a massacre in the early 1700s when settlers slaughtered a native village and left the ground soaked in blood. The Vandergasts claimed descent from those same settlers. Others whispered they were descended from the murdered. Either way, the land seemed to answer only to them. What made the sisters infamous was not their beauty nor their intelligence, but the way they controlled fate. The stories always began the same. Someone crossed the Vandergasts, and soon after, misfortune struck. A merchant who refused them credit found his wagons overturned on the mountain road, every mule broken-legged. A pastor who denounced them from the pulpit lost his voice forever, his throat swelling it until he could only croak like a frog. A judge who refused to sign a land claim for them was discovered dead in his bed, his veins black as tar. These weren't random accidents, they were curses, and people knew it. Eliza Vandergast was said to carry a book bound in human skin, filled with names. Every time she was wronged, she wrote the offender's name in red ink, and once written, it was only a matter of time. Whole family trees withered after being inscribed, children stillborn, cattle sickly, roofs collapsing in fire. Margaret was the maker. Her sewing seemed ordinary enough. Shawls, quilts, and doll dresses sold in the market. But those who bought them often came to regret it. A farmer's wife who wore one of Margaret's shawls grew ill and wasted away. A child who played with one of her dolls was found lifeless the next morning. They said Margaret's stitching bound not cloth, but souls. She wove threads of hair into her garments, bits of teeth into her dolls, and in so doing, trapped the life force of those around her. And then there was Clara. Sweet Clara, the youngest. They called her the Crimson Bride because she could take any man she wanted and destroy him just as easily. Men who courted her grew obsessed, abandoning wives and children. Those who tried to leave her wasted away in madness, hearing her voice in the wind, dreaming of her every night until they lost themselves. One man leapt from the cliffs at Bloodvale, screaming her name as the rocks crushed his body. The sisters were feared, yes, but also respected, for their power was useful. A woman who wanted her cruel husband to suffer could bring hair or clothing to the Vandergasts, and within days the man might fall ill. A family plagued by rivals could pay in coin, and the rivals would wither. Farmers brought offerings, eggs, milk, lambs, to the Vandergast doorstep in hopes their crops would thrive. The sisters became arbiters of fate, the mountain's true judges. But with every bargain came a cost. One story tells of a midwife who begged Eliza to save her dying child. Eliza agreed, asking, "Gee, only for a small sacrifice." The mother gave her a lock of hair, and the baby lived. But the next morning, the mother found her husband hanging in the barn, his eyes wide and mouth twisted in terror. The sisters always took payment, whether you gave it freely or not. Their true darkness revealed itself in the harvest curse of 1884. That year, the valley suffered a drought. Crops withered, livestock starved, and the people turned desperate. The townsfolk pleaded with the Vandergasts to bring rain, for it was said they could whisper to the sky and stir clouds from the mountains. The sisters agreed, but demanded a tithe. Not of grain, not of money, but of blood. They asked for 3 children. The valley refused. For weeks the drought worsened. Then one night, lightning split the sky and a firestorm swept through Bloodvale. Dozens of homes burned. Families fled into the forest only to find their paths blocked by fallen trees, their wells turned to sludge, their food stores crawling with worms. The next morning, the villagers returned to their homes only to find 3 children missing. No bodies were ever recovered, but from that day forward, the Vandergast estate thrived. Their gardens overflowed, their livestock grew fat, their streams ran clear, even while the rest of the valley starved. People knew the truth. The children had been taken, and the curse of the Vandergasts had been fed. By the early 1900s, whispers of witchcraft spread beyond the mountains. Outsiders came to investigate, journalists, ministers, self-proclaimed witch hunters. Few returned with anything concrete. But one man, a circuit preacher, claimed to have entered their estate and found something beyond belief. He described a hall where the walls were covered in woven tapestries of human hair. He saw candles made from marrow, dolls with real eyes stitched into their sockets, and a great loom in the center of the house where Margaret worked. The loom's threads shimmered not like string, but like veins, pulsing as if alive. With every turn of the loom he swore he heard cries, infants, mothers, men screaming in agony. The preacher fled, spreading his testimony across the state. Within months, a mob formed, but when they stormed the Vandergast estate, they found the house abandoned. Food still sat warm on the table, sewing still lay upon the loom, but the sisters were gone. Some say they fled deeper into the mountains where they still live, their bloodline hidden among quiet families. Others claim they joined their craft, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the valley. Hunters tell of quilts found in abandoned cabins, still warm to the touch, whispering softly when held. Hikers vanish in Bloodvale, leaving only strands of hair tangled in the branches. And some swear that when fog thickens in the hollow, you can see 3 women walking hand in hand, their eyes gleaming red. The Vandergasts remain a name people whisper with dread. Unlike the Crowleys who built monuments or the Ashworths who kept corpses, the sisters worked in shadows. Their legacy was not in bone, but in thread, curse, and blood. And perhaps the most terrifying thought of all is this: curses do not die. They linger, they multiply. And if the Vandergast sisters truly wove their spells into the valley itself, then every child born in Bloodvale today may still be tangled in their thread. Ironwood Gap was not a place people chose to live. It was where you ended up when you had nowhere else. The hollow was flanked by cliffs so steep they cut the sunlight into slivers, leaving much of the land in a near-permanent twilight. Locals swore the shadows there behaved differently. They stretched too far. They twitched when no one moved. They swallowed sound. Some said even God's light avoided Ironwood Gap, and that's why the Halloways thrived there. The Halloways were not old money like the Crowleys, nor cunning like the Vandergast sisters. They were poor, barefoot people, but they carried a power that couldn't be bought or stitched. They called it the Shade. The Shade wasn't taught, it was inherited. Every Halloway child was taken into the woods on their 12th birthday and left alone at dusk. The family said it was a rite of passage. Survive the night and you came back marked. Fail, and the shadows kept you. What happened in those woods was rarely spoken of, but when the children returned, they were different. Their eyes looked sunken, as if something behind them stared out. Their skin was colder than the air. Some bore faint handprints burned into their shoulders or arms, as though something had grasped them in the dark, and from that day on, they could do things no human should. The first recorded story was of Ephraim Halloway, born in 1821. After his 12th night rite, he returned pale and silent. That winter, when a neighbor accused his father of theft, Ephraim whispered something under his breath. Within 3 days, the neighbor was dead, found at his kitchen table, eyes wide, his own shadow wrapped around his throat like a rope. From then on, the Halloways were feared. They weren't like the Vandergasts, who offered curses for coin, or the Crowleys, who flaunted power openly. The Halloways didn't trade. They didn't threaten. They simply watched. If someone wronged them, their shadow lengthened unnaturally, curling across floors, creeping up walls. Within a week, illness or accident struck. Their shadows were their executioners. It wasn't just vengeance. The Halloways used the shade to survive. When crops failed, their fields alone remained fertile, because the soil drank darkness. When winters grew harsh, their fires never went out, for the flames themselves seemed to lean toward them, as though afraid to die. Hunters swore that deer walked willingly into their traps. Their eyes glazed as if guided by unseen strings. But there was a price, always a price. Each time the Halloways called upon the shade, they lost something. Some lost their hearing, others lost their teeth, their hair, their strength, but most terrible of all was when the shade claimed their years. It was said no Halloway ever lived past 40. Their bodies withered unnaturally fast, as if their very lifespan had been bartered away. A Halloway might look old and grey at 35, their skin sagging, bones brittle, and yet their shadows remained strong, more alive than the bodies they clung to. The family leaned into this curse. They called themselves the Hollowborn. Some believed the Halloways were less human with each generation, their bloodline thinning, their shadows fattening. The worst example came with Silas Halloway, born in 1874. He was said to be the most powerful shade-bearer of them all. His shadow often moved on its own, even in front of witnesses. It crawled across the floor like a living thing, wrapping around objects, stroking walls. Once a schoolteacher beat him for blasphemy. The next morning the teacher was found hanging in his classroom, though no rope was tied around his neck. His shadow alone had strung him up. By his 20s, Silas's body had decayed prematurely and his hair fell out, his teeth blackened, his spine hunched. But the shade fed on him, grew from him. People claimed his shadow was no longer his. It was a second figure, towering behind him, with long fingers and eyes that glowed faint red in lamplight. The climax of the Halloway curse came in 1901, with what locals still call the Night of the Swallowed Town. Ironwood Gap had been suffering. Strange disappearances plagued the region. Hunters never returned. Wagons overturned with no tracks around them. Then one night, a storm rolled in, blacker than any storm before. Rain didn't fall. Instead, darkness poured from the sky, covering the ground like ink. The villagers swore they saw shadows rising up, taller than houses, moving like men, but without faces. At their center stood Silas Halloway, his own body frail but his shade vast, swallowing lanterns, fires, even the moonlight itself. By morning, half the town was gone. Not burned, not destroyed, simply erased. Houses stood empty, fields lay fallow, but no people remained. no livestock, no dogs barking, just silence. The few survivors who crawled away told the same story. The shadows had taken them. Whole families dragged screaming into the ground, their bodies melting into darkness. Silas himself was never seen again. Some say he gave himself fully to the shade, trading his last breath for immortality inside the dark. Others believe he was consumed like the rest, leaving only his legacy behind. Today, Ironwood Gap is a ghost hollow. No one lives there. Travelers who pass through claim they hear whispers at night, their own shadows stretching unnaturally far. Some see silhouettes of people where no one stands, shadows of children playing, women walking, men digging in fields. But when light touches them, nothing is there. And sometimes, in photographs taken near the hollow, dark figures appear behind the living, their eyes faint red, their mouths wide with silent screams. Locals say these are the Halloways, still bound to their shade, still feeding, still waiting. The most chilling thought: shadows are everywhere. You can't escape them. You can't outwalk them. They are tied to you. And if the Halloways truly learned how to make shadows independent, if they fed them until they became something more, then who's to say your shadow isn't already learning to move without you? Shatterbone Ridge was named long before the McBrides settled there. Hunters said the ridge was littered with splintered skeletons of animals, elk, wolves, even bears, as if something unseen had crushed them all in one place. The land carried a crunch when you walked across it, like stepping on brittle glass. When the McBrides arrived in the early 1800s, they didn't shy away from the ridge. They claimed it, built their cabins right atop the bone fields, dug their wells through marrow-soaked earth. But they did more than live there. They listened. The McBrides believed bones carried memory, that every fracture, every groove recorded the life of the creature it once supported. To them, a bone wasn't just remains. It was a book, a diary, a vessel of power, and they learned how to read it. It began with Malachi McBride, the patriarch. He was a trapper, a man who spent his youth breaking animals down for fur and meat. But when he settled on Shatterbone Ridge, he began experimenting. Locals whispered he would boil bones for days, then hold them to his ear, as if listening to seashells. What he claimed to hear were voices, not words exactly, but impressions, growls, howls, screams, memories of how the animal had lived and died. Soon Malachi learned to use those echoes. He fashioned charms from deer vertebrae, necklaces of wolf fangs strung with copper wire, whistles carved from bird bones. These weren't trinkets, they held power. Hunters who carried them returned with full kills. Farmers wearing his bone charms never lost livestock to predators. But there was a darker side. Those same charms could harm. A man who crossed Malachi was found days later with his back twisted unnaturally, his spine bent like a deer crushed in a trap. Another drowned in his own yard, though there was no water near him. Only a bird-bone whistle clenched in his dead hand. It became clear. The McBrides weren't just listening to the bones, they were commanding them. By the time Malachi's children came of age, the practice had grown into ritual. Each McBride child was given a knife and taken to the ridge at midnight. There, under the pale light of the moon, they were told to dig until they struck bone. Whatever skeleton they uncovered, wolf, deer, bear, became their guardian spirit. The child would carve a charm from that skeleton and wear it for life. It was said the animal's soul fused with their own, binding bone to blood. But the price was steep. As the McBride grew, they began to resemble their chosen creature. One daughter's teeth sharpened unnaturally, matching the wolf she had dug up. A son's shoulders hunched broad, his fingernails black and curved like a bear's claws. Their voices grew guttural, their tempers wild. By the third generation, the McBrides were no longer entirely human. Travelers told of meeting them in the woods, hulking figures with antler-like protrusions beneath their skin, faces too long, eyes too reflective. And always they carried bone weapons, blades honed from femurs, clubs of fused spines, rattles made from knuckle bones that sent grown men fleeing. But the most terrifying were the bone keepers. Every few decades, one McBride child was chosen to inherit the family's greatest ritual. These were not bound to animal bones, they were bound to human ones. The bone keepers kept the remains of every McBride who had died. They boiled them, cleaned them, and stacked them inside the family's underground crypts. From these bones they crafted instruments of impossible power, flutes made from leg bones that could summon storms, drums from rib cages that drove men to madness, charms from skull fragments that whispered in the dark. One bonekeeper, Eliza McBride, was said to carry her mother's jawbone in a pouch, using it to speak with the dead. Witnesses claimed she would pull it out during disputes, place it on the table, and the jaw would move on its own, delivering judgment. The clan's P.O.A. reached its peak in the late 1800s. Neighboring families avoided them, but when hardship struck, they always came crawling. Want your harvest to thrive? Bring a goat skull and an offering of blood. Want to curse your rival? Leave his name scratched into a deer femur. The McBrides would deliver, but with each favor, their humanity thinned. Their children were born stranger with every generation. One boy's arms bent backward like a stag's legs. Another child had hollow eyes, black and glistening, like sockets without pupils. By 1899, whispers spread that the McBrides had gone too far. A traveling preacher, horrified by what he saw on the ridge, declared them an abomination. A family of bone thieves who fed not on flesh, but on the marrow of men. He claimed their crypts held not only their own dead, but neighbors, travelers, even children. The preacher rallied a mob. Torches were lit. Dozens marched up the ridge to destroy the clan once and for all. But what happened next was never forgotten. As the mob approached the McBride homestead, the family emerged, not with guns, but with bones. Each member carried their charms, their weapons, their relics, and when the mob advanced, the McBrides struck their bone rattles in unison. The earth groaned. The ridge split. From the ground erupted a sound like thousands of teeth grinding. And then, the bones themselves rose. Skeletal remains of animals poured out of the earth. Elk, wolves, bears, moving like puppets, their joints grinding, their hollow eyes burning faint with unnatural fire. Some swore even human skeletons clawed their way up, staggering forward in silence. The mob didn't stand a chance. By dawn, Shatterbone Ridge was littered with corpses. Though many had no flesh left, only bones cracked and arranged neatly, as if catalogued. The McBrides vanished soon after. Their cabins were found empty, their crypts lead shut. Some say they fled deeper into the mountains. Others claim they simply dissolved into bone dust, feeding the land that had fed them. To this day, hikers avoid the ridge. Those who dare to camp there at night speak of rattling noises beneath the soil, as if bones are shifting just below. Some find small charms on their tents in the morning, vertebrae strung on twine, or teeth arranged in circles. And the most disturbing stories, hikers waking to find skeletons standing at the edge of camp, silent, unmoving, until dawn drives them back into the earth. The McBrides are gone, but their bone army never left. Devil's Trough was a narrow gorge, a jagged scar carved into the heart of Appalachia. Locals said it was cursed from the beginning, a place where sunlight rarely reached, where winds funneled screams through the rocks, and where animals avoided drinking from the creek that ran red during floods. But the Caldwells didn't just settle there, they claimed it as if it had been waiting for them all along. The family arrived in the 1830s, led by Absalom Caldwell, a preacher who'd been cast out of his congregation for heresy. His sermons were said to drip with venom, not salvation, promising followers not heaven, but dominion over the living and the dead. When his flock abandoned him, Absalom took his wife, his 7 children, and a handful of loyal disciples into the mountains. There in Devil's Trough, they built a church, not of white clapboard and steeples, but of black pine soaked in pitch, with a spire that leaned like a crooked finger. They called it the Sanctuary of Eternal Flame, but the villagers in the nearest town gave it another name, the Wraith Church. At first, the Caldwells lived like any other isolated family, farming, hunting, raising livestock. But their Sunday gatherings grew louder, stranger. Travelers spoke of bonfires blazing all night, shadows writhing against the gorge walls, and hymns sung backward in languages no one could place. The family claimed they were purifying themselves, shedding sin through fire and blood. But soon, animals in the valley began to vanish. Pigs, goats, even dogs. Their bones were later found scattered near the gorge, charred black, gnawed as if by teeth that weren't entirely human. Then the neighbors began to vanish too. A merchant on his way through the pass never arrived in town. A widow fetching water was swallowed by the gorge, her bucket found upright on the bank. Each disappearance was blamed on the trough itself, until a farmer claimed he saw the truth with his own eyes. A Caldwell child, pale as ash, dragging something limp into the church basement. When the sheriff confronted Absalom, the preacher smiled. He said his family had been chosen, that they were not to be judged by mortal law, but by the flame that never dies. He invited the sheriff to witness their ceremony. The sheriff refused. 3 nights later, the sheriff's house burned to the ground. His family was never found. By the 1850s, the Caldwells were legends. No one entered Devil's Trough willingly, but their rituals only grew more obscene. Witnesses hiding on the ridges claimed the Caldwells didn't just sacrifice animals, they sacrificed themselves. During their rites, a Caldwell would walk willingly into the bonfire, their flesh peeling in the heat, screaming hymns until their voice broke. The next week, that same Caldwell would be seen walking the gorge again, skin blistered, eyes empty, yet alive. It was as if death had no hold on them. Stories spread of wraith-like figures drifting through the valley, pale, hollow-eyed, cloaked in smoke, their mouths moving as if in constant prayer. Hunters shot at them, but the bullets passed clean through. Travelers swore they felt hands grip their shoulders in the dark, only to find no one behind them. The worst tales came from those who claimed to enter the Wraith Church itself. They said the walls breathed with heat and shadows of the dead clung to the rafters. They said the altar was a slab of blackened stone, slick with centuries of blood, and in the center of it all, behind the pulpit, burned a flame that never went out. A cold fire, blue and ghostly, that seemed to devour without consuming. The Caldwells fed it, and in return, it fed them. By the time Absalom Caldwell died, if he truly did, his descendants had become something beyond human. Their bodies were gaunt, their skin stretched tight, their eyes reflecting firelight even in the dark. Some had stopped speaking altogether, communicating only in whispers and guttural moans, but their presence was undeniable. Farmers for miles around woke to find ash smeared on their doors. A warning. Children spoke of pale faces watching from the tree line, vanishing when approached, and during every fire in the valley, barn, cabin, even a courthouse, witnesses swore they saw Caldwell figures walking calmly through the flames, untouched, mouths open as if swallowing the smoke. No one dared to confront them, not until 1872. That year, a mining company tried to drive a rail line through Devil's Trough. Crews arrived with dynamite, axes, and a promise of progress. They tore down part of the gorge wall and set camp near the Caldwell's church. 3 nights later, the entire camp was gone. Over 100 men vanished. Their tents stood untouched, meals half-eaten, tools laid out as if frozen mid-work. The only trace was the smell of smoke and a single symbol burned into the earth, a blackened handprint the size of a man's chest. The rail company abandoned the project. Devil's Trough was left to the Caldwells, but by the early 1900s the family seemed to wither. The Wraith Church fell silent. The fires no longer lit the gorge. Locals whispered they had burned themselves into nothing, or ascended to whatever infernal god they worshipped. Still, the gorge remains avoided. Campers who dare to enter speak of waking to ash on their skin, their clothes reeking of smoke though no fire burned. Some hear hymns echoing in the rocks, voices layered on voices, chanting words that make no sense. And on rare nights, when the wind shifts just right, a tita's old flame flickers deep in the trough, blue, unyielding, hungry. The Caldwells may be gone, but their wraiths never left. Black Hollow was a valley that swallowed the sun. Even at midday, its trees knitted so tightly that light only fell in fractured slivers. The soil was fertile, yes, but it birthed crops twisted in shape, corn that grew in spirals, beans that sprouted with blackened pods, and at the heart of that hollow, for over 200 years, lived the Hollis family. They were farmers, miners, midwives, and preachers at different times, but their neighbors always whispered the same thing: the Hollises don't bury their own. The first man to bear the name was Isaac Hollis, who came to Appalachia in the 1700s with a reputation already blackened. Court records from Virginia accused him of trafficking with shadows, though no one wrote exactly what that meant. By the time he built his homestead in Black Hollow, he had a wife and 3 children. Within a year, the wife and 2 children were dead, but Isaac didn't grieve. Witnesses said he carried their bodies into the woods behind his cabin. No graves were ever dug, no headstones were ever raised. He came back alone, always with dirt under his nails, his eyes a little darker each time. The family line continued through his only surviving son, and from there the pattern began. Each generation of Hollis fathers lost a child mysteriously, always the youngest. The disappearances were explained away. Sickness, wolves, even accidents. But people in Black Hollow whispered the truth. The Hollises were feeding their children to something beneath the earth. By the 1820s, the Hollow had earned a reputation. Midwives who helped Hollis women deliver babies swore they heard strange voices in the birthing rooms. Not the cries of newborns, but the low murmur of men chanting in the walls. Sometimes those babies didn't live past the first winter. Sometimes they weren't seen again after a single night, and each time the family grew richer. Land grants fell into their hands. Miners struck veins of coal exactly where Hollis men dug. Their barns never rotted, their livestock never starved. Neighbors began to suspect what was happening. The Hollises were trading blood for fortune. But the darkest tale came in 1847. That year, a schoolteacher named Eleanor Briggs rented a cabin near the Hollow. She taught the children of miners, and against warnings, she took in 3 Hollis boys. She said they were bright, quick to learn, though strangely quiet. They drew strange shapes in the margins of their papers. Spirals, eyes, hands with too many fingers. One morning, Eleanor arrived to find all 3 gone. Their desks were empty, their books still open. On the schoolhouse wall was a single handprint in dried blood, not small like a child's, not large like a man's, but something stretched and unnatural. Eleanor fled the valley that same day. She lived to 80 years old, and on her deathbed, she swore the Hollises gave their sons to the Hollow. By the turn of the 20th century, the Hollis family was one of the wealthiest in the region. They built a mansion of black oak and stone on the ridge, overlooking everything below. Locals called it the Nest. From a distance it looked like a great bird's perch, jagged and watching. But inside, the family was unraveling. Visitors described the children as pale, with eyes too large for their faces, speaking in voices that echoed unnaturally. Some of them refused to eat food at all, surviving instead on dirt they scooped from the riverbanks. One boy, Daniel Hollis, was said to sleepwalk into the woods night after night. When his mother tried to follow, she claimed the earth itself opened. A narrow fissure breathing steam. She saw her son step inside and vanish, as if swallowed whole. He was never seen again. By the 1920s, the Hollises weren't just feared. They were despised. Farmers blamed them for blights. Inners blamed them for cave-ins. Children swore they saw figures moving inside the nest long after the family should have been asleep. Shapes in the windows moving from wall to wall, too tall and thin to be human. Finally, in 1933, a mob formed. Torches, shotguns, axes. They climbed the ridge and stormed the nest. But when they broke down the doors, they found the mansion empty. The beds were made, the hearth was warm, the table was set for dinner. But no Hollis was inside. Only one thing remained, a spiral carved deep into the dining table, burned into the wood. It spun inward endlessly, as though meant to draw the eye until you couldn't look away. Some men claimed to hear whispers while standing near it. Others refused to touch it at all. The table was dragged outside and set ablaze. It didn't burn. The nest still stands today, abandoned, windows shattered, floors sagging. Explorers who dare to enter say the air tastes like iron. Some come back with nosebleeds, ears ringing. A few never come back at all. Locals still swear the Hollises aren't gone, that they live underground beneath the Hollow in chambers carved into the rock, that they walk the woods on moonless nights, pale figures with black spirals spinning in their eyes. And some whisper the worst fear of all, that they're still trading, offering blood for fortune, but this time not just their own. Silent Creek was the kind of place you didn't stumble into by accident. The stream ran narrow and black, its water carrying the smell of rust and moss. No birds sang there, no frogs croaked. Even in summer the air felt heavy, muffled, as if sound itself died before reaching the ear. At the heart of this quiet valley lived the Bishop clan. They weren't farmers or miners like most families in Appalachia. They lived on the edge of the creek in cabins made of mismatched wood, each one tilting slightly, as though trying to lean away from the water. And the Bishops spoke little, too little. Neighbors said they would go entire months without a single word. When they did speak, it was in short, broken sentences, never above a whisper. Strangers thought them odd. Locals thought them cursed. The oldest tale dates back to the late 1700s, when Nathaniel Bishop, the clan's patriarch, arrived with his wife and 5 children. According to rumor, they had been driven out of Virginia after a scandal in which 3 parishioners at their church had gone missing, last seen attending a bishop-led prayer meeting. When Nathaniel settled at Silent Creek, he built not just cabins but a church of his own. He called it the Chapel of Stillness. And here's where the story turns. The chapel had no bell, no choir, no hymns. Services were conducted entirely in silence. The bishops would gather inside, close the doors and sit without a word for hours. People who tried to peek through the cracks swore they saw the bishops swaying in unison, mouths opening and closing without sound, as though speaking to something only they could hear. After these meetings, strange events followed. Cows were found with their tongues removed. Hunters went missing, their rifles discovered by the creek. Children from neighboring farms would wake screaming, claiming to have seen the Whisper Men standing at their windows. No tracks were ever found, only silence. By the mid-1800s, the Bishop clan had grown to nearly 50 members. They intermarried, cousins marrying cousins, and their features began to sharpen in uncanny ways. High cheekbones, sunken eyes, lips that seemed almost too thin to conceal, teeth. And still their eerie quiet. But the most terrifying habit was this. The bishops never named their children until the age of 7. For the first 7 years, the children were called only boy or girl. If anyone asked why, the clan gave the same answer, whispered low, because not all of them stay. What did they mean? Neighbors soon found out. At least once every 2 winters, a bishop child would vanish. No body, no trace, only a line of small footprints leading to Silent Creek and ending at the water's edge. The family never searched, never wept, never spoke of the lost child again. It was as if they believed the creek had claimed them, or worse, that the clan had offered them. One story still chills those who live nearby. In 1862, during the Civil War, deserters stumbled into Silent Creek. Hungry, ragged, they knocked at the bishop cabins for food. The clan welcomed them in. Days later, when Union scouts came looking, they found the cabins empty, save for a single table inside the Chapel of Stillness. On it lay 6 sets of neatly folded uniforms, 6 rifles, and 6 tongues. The bishops were never accused, never arrested. But the legend spread. Silent Creek doesn't echo because the bishops took sound for themselves. By the early 1900s, the family's power seemed to fade. Many died of disease. Others drifted away. But the strangest were the disappearances. Whole branches of the family tree simply went missing. Cabins left with half-cooked meals, laundry hanging on lines, fires still smoldering in hearths. People said the bishops weren't gone. They had followed the silence underground. Hikers in the 1930s told of stumbling into caves near the creek and hearing faint whispers, though no one was behind them. Some swore they saw pale figures retreating into the rock. The last recorded sighting of a bishop came in 1941. A woman named Agnes Bishop walked into a general store in Logan County. She bought salt, rope, and kerosene. She never spoke a word, only nodded. When the clerk turned away, she was gone. To this day, the people of Appalachia warn children not to linger near Silent Creek. They say if you shout, your voice won't return to you. And if you whisper, the bishops will hear, even if they've been gone for 100 years. Some swear the clan made a pact, their silence for survival, that they traded voices for life everlasting, that deep beneath Silent Creek, the bishops are still waiting, listening, mouths open in wordless prayer. And if you're unlucky enough to wander too close on a moonless night, you might feel it. A hand on your shoulder, a breath on your neck, a mouth opening against your ear, not to speak, but to take your voice away. The Callaways of Ironwood Ridge were never quite considered a family in the usual sense. To the mountain folk who whispered their name, they were something far older, darker, something closer to a covenant bound in blood than a simple household. Ironwood Ridge itself was a place that seemed cursed before the first Callaway ever set foot there. The soil was strange, black as coal, but too soft to plant. Trees grew twisted, their trunks warped into shapes that seemed almost human. Travelers reported hearing faint lag, hitter echoing through the hollows at night, though no cabin stood for miles. It was here, in the early 1800s that Margaret Calloway, a midwife with a reputation for unnatural practices, built her home. But Margaret didn't come alone. She brought with her 9 daughters, each fathered by a man whose name she refused to reveal. The daughters were said to be beautiful in a way that unsettled those who saw them. Eyes too bright, smiles too sharp, voices that seemed to harmonize even when they spoke separately. The Calloway women did not attend church. They did not court local men. They did not ask for neighbors' help during harsh winters. Instead, they gathered herbs from the woods, boiled strange teas, and were known to burn small bundles of twigs tied with red thread at their doors. Locals began to whisper the obvious word: witches. The first real proof came in 1825, when an epidemic swept through the valley. Children fell ill, coughing blood, fevered and delirious. Families prayed, pastors preached, but nothing seemed to stop it. And then the Calloways arrived. One night, under a full moon, Margaret and her daughters walked from cabin to cabin. Each carried a clay jar filled with a foul-smelling liquid. They smeared it across doorframes, muttered words in a language no one recognized, and vanished back to the ridge. By morning, every child who had been sick was suddenly better. The epidemic ended overnight. Grateful parents tried to thank the Calloways, but the women wanted nothing. No food, no money, no company. But within the month, 3 of those children disappeared, gone from their beds. No doors broken, no tracks outside. The only clue? A set of muddy handprints on the walls, far too small to be an adult's, yet each print had 6 fingers. The locals never accused the Calloways outright, but suspicion grew. And with suspicion came fear. The Calloway daughters grew into women, and rumors only deepened. Men who went to court them never returned. Hunters who crossed Ironwood Ridge came back pale and silent, or not at all. Some claimed the daughters could bend the minds of men, speaking into their dreams until they followed the women willingly into the woods, never to emerge. Others said the Calloways could change shape, taking the forms of foxes, owls, or even shadows. A farmer swore he saw one of the sisters on all fours in his field, her head twisting unnaturally as her eyes glowed red in the moonlight. But the darkest stories were about their children. Each daughter bore children of her own, but never in front of witnesses. No one ever saw them pregnant. Instead, they would disappear for months at a time into the woods, only to return with an infant wrapped in black cloth. And those children were not like others. Some had teeth when they were born, some never cried, only stared wide-eyed into the dark. Some refused to eat unless fed raw meat, and nearly all of them vanished before reaching adulthood. Locals believed the Calloways were offering them up to what no one dared to say. The end, or at least the disappearance of the coven, came in 1894. A group of townsmen, emboldened by a traveling preacher, marched up Ironwood Ridge carrying rifles, axes, and torches. They claimed it was time to end the Calloway curse once and for all. But when they reached the Calloway cabin, they found it empty. The doors were wide open, food sat half-eaten on the table, and a pot of tea steamed on the hearth. Upstairs, beds were unmade, as if abandoned in the middle of sleep. And yet, every room smelled faintly of iron and ash. The only sign of the family was in the cellar, where the men found a circle of stones arranged around a pit of ashes. But inside the pit were 9 dolls, each made of twigs and bound with human hair. One by one, the men destroyed the dolls. That night, storms raged across the ridge. Lightning split trees, floods tore through the valley, and for 3 days the sky stayed black. When it cleared, Ironwood Ridge was silent. The Calloways never returned. But hikers in the 20th century reported strange things: fires burning in the woods where no campers were, women's laughter echoing in the fog, and black-clad figures watching from the trees. And sometimes, if they walked too far, they'd find small clay jars on the forest floor, sealed with wax, filled with a foul-smelling liquid. The jars were always warm to the touch. Today, locals warn their daughters never to wander Ironwood Ridge after dark. They say the Calloways aren't gone, only waiting for new blood to add to their coven. And if you hear laughter in the woods that seems to come from more than one voice at once, you'd best run, because the Calloways are still choosing who belongs to them. Coal Hollow was never meant to be lived in. Even in the 1800s, the miners who worked the seams said the land seemed wrong. The air was always a little too warm, the ground shook with low groans when no trains were passing, and sometimes, when the wind was still, you could smell smoke underground as though the earth itself was burning. It was here that the Wendell family made their fortune, and it was here that their story descended into one of the most chilling legends whispered through Appalachia. The Wendell patriarch, Samuel Wendell, was said to have been a man with ambition that outpaced his morality. He came to Coal Hollow in the 1850s with little more than a pickaxe and a mule, but within 20 years he had bought up the land and opened one of the most profitable mines in the region. Locals claimed Samuel had help, though no one knew from who, or what. The Wendell mines were different. While neighboring families lost men daily to cave-ins and suffocating gas, Samuel's workers returned alive day after day, and the coal that came out of Wendell's Hollow burned hotter, brighter, and longer than any other. It was coal that seemed alive with fire. By the 1870s, Samuel Wendell was a wealthy man, but it wasn't his riches that unnerved the townsfolk. It was his sons. There were 3 of them: Thomas, Elijah, and Caleb Wendell. From the time they were boys, people noticed they were not like other children. Their eyes had a strange gleam, like embers flickering beneath the surface. Their skin was always warm to the touch, even in winter. And when they laughed, it had a crackle to it, sharp and unsettling, like fire catching dry leaves. But what frightened people most was the way they could control fire. It began with parlor tricks. The boys could hold burning coals in their hands without flinching. They could blow on a candle and not extinguish it, but make the flame rise higher, twisting into shapes. Then came the darker stories. A rival boy who mocked them was found in the woods. His body burned, though not a single tree around him had caught fire. A barn belonging to a miner who refused to work for Samuel was consumed in flames, though no lightning, lantern, or spark had been near it. The Wendell brothers, it seemed, carried fire wherever they went. By the time Samuel died in 1881, the brothers had taken over the mines. Under their control, Coal Hollow prospered even more, but at a terrible cost. Miners began disappearing. At first 1 or 2, men who wandered too deep underground, but soon whole crews vanished, leaving only tools and scorched clothing behind. Survivors whispered that the brothers would sometimes walk into the mines without lanterns, yet the walls glowed with light, as if the stone itself obeyed them. They claimed the brothers would summon fire from their bare hands, igniting seams of coal as easily as striking a match. And then came the most chilling rumor of all, that the Wendells were feeding the fire beneath Coal Hollow. They weren't just mining coal, they were keeping something alive. The legend says the Wendell brothers had made a pact, an unholy bargain with whatever force slept beneath the mountains. Some said it was the devil himself. Others believed it was an ancient fire spirit bound in the earth long before settlers arrived. In exchange for riches and power, the brothers offered sacrifices. Not goats, not cattle, but men. Miners who descended too deep never returned because they were given to the fire. And the brothers grew stronger, their skin glowing faintly, their laughter echoing through the tunnels like the roar of a furnace. The end came in 1899, in what locals still call the Night of Cinders. The Wendell brothers had pushed the miners to open a new shaft, one that burrowed directly beneath the ridge where the oldest coal seam lay. The men worked reluctantly, but wages were high, and mouths at home needed feeding. On a sweltering summer night, a dozen miners entered the hollow. By morning, none returned. When search parties arrived, they found the shaft blazing with an unnatural fire. Not orange, but white, so hot it melted the very stone around it. From within the flames, witnesses swore they saw figures, 3 tall men, their eyes glowing like molten steel, their mouths open in laughter. The Wendell brothers. The fire consumed the mine, the ridge, and every tree for half a mile. When it finally burned out days later, nothing remained of the Wendell home, the mine, or the brothers themselves. Only blackened earth that still smoldered when touched. Coal Hollow was abandoned, but here's where the legend refuses to die. In the decades since, strange fires have erupted in the region, fields igniting without lightning, homes catching fire in the dead of winter with no hearth lit, and miners who dared explore the abandoned shafts reported hearing voices in the dark. 3 voices, laughing together. Sometimes the tunnels glowed faintly, as if codes. All veins were still alive, pulsing with heat. And there are those who swear that on the hottest nights of summer, if you walk too close to Coal Hollow, the ground grows warm under your feet. If you stop and listen, you'll hear the sound of fire breathing beneath the soil. The Wendell brothers, some say, are not gone at all. They are waiting, bound to the fire they once served, calling for new sacrifices to keep their pact alive. If you drive the back roads of Appalachia long enough, you'll pass places where the forest seems thicker, the shadows heavier. But few are as unsettling as Deadman's Creek, a narrow stretch of water that winds through the mountains of Kentucky. No fish swim there, no birds call in its trees. Even the deer that roam the ridges avoid its banks. The locals say the land remembers what happened there, and what happened there was the story of the Griggs family. The Griggses weren't just poor, they were destitute, even by Appalachian standards. Their home was nothing more than a sagging cabin half buried in the earth, with a roof patched by animal hides and rusted tin. They lived off the land and whatever they could steal from travelers unfortunate enough to cross the creek. At first, their crimes were small: a chicken stolen from a nearby farm, a mule gone missing, a wagon tipped in the mud, its supplies plundered in the night. But as the years passed, the family's violence escalated. There were 6 of them, led by the father, Matthias Griggs, a man said to have been born mean. He had a face like stone, cold and hard, and hands calloused from trapping and skinning. His wife, Eleanor, was no better. Rumors claimed she taught her children to set snares not just for animals but for people. Their children, Hiram, Jesse, Ruth and Amos, grew into predators. By their teens, they could track a man through the woods as easily as a deer. Their rifles never missed. And when they caught someone, they didn't just rob them, they made an example of them. The Griggses became infamous for the way they displayed their victims. Travelers were sometimes found tied to trees, their throats slit, their bodies left as warnings to others who might venture near Deadman's Creek. Other times nothing was found at all, just torn clothing, a wagon wheel, and blood soaking into the dirt. But the most terrifying rumors said the Griggs family didn't just kill to steal, they killed because they enjoyed it. Neighbors whispered of strangy, in noises drifting through the trees at night, screams mingled with laughter. Some swore they heard drums, though no one in those hills played them, and others told of stumbling upon the Griggs cabin and seeing smoke rising from the chimney when no woodpile was stacked outside. Meat roasted in that house, but no one ever saw a deer hung from their rafters. The turning point came in the winter of 1894. A preacher named Reverend Alden Pike organized a search party after several families traveling west disappeared near Deadman's Creek. With lanterns and rifles, the men trudged through the snow, following the trail of wagon ruts until they reached the Griggs homestead. What they found was worse than anything they imagined. Inside the cabin, bones hung from the rafters, strung like ornaments. Skulls sat on the mantel, blackened from fire. A pot simmered on the hearth, filled with something no one dared name. And in the center of the dirt floor lay a crude circle carved into the ground, stained dark as though it had been fed again and again with blood. The Griggses were nowhere to be found. The search parties combed the forest for weeks. They found traps, wicked things made from sharpened stakes and hidden pits, but not the family themselves. Then, one by one, the hunters began to vanish. A man would step away from the group, only to scream in the dark. When the lanterns turned, there was nothing but blood in the snow. By spring, Deadman's Creek was abandoned. No one dared hunt there, fish there, or even cross it. The Griggs family had melted into the woods, becoming something more myth than flesh. But their story didn't end. For decades afterward, bodies continued to appear along Deadman's Creek. Hikers, loggers, drifters, always mutilated, always displayed. Some claim to have seen pale figures moving among the trees, carrying rifles on their shoulders, their eyes glowing Feuds, intly in the moonlight. Others swore the Griggses had stopped being entirely human, that they had given themselves over to some darker power, feeding the land with blood in exchange for survival. The cabin eventually rotted into the earth, but the circle in the dirt floor never faded. Those who have dared visit in modern times say the ground there feels different, softer, as if it's still hungry. And sometimes at night you can hear it. Laughter, thin and sharp, drifting across the water. The Griggses are still out there, people say, watching, waiting, keeping their creek. Black Hollow Road had always been avoided. The trees seemed too close together, bending toward the dirt path as though they wanted to swallow it. Even in daylight, shadows clung to that place. It was here in the late 1800s that the Miller clan took root. The patriarch, Jonas Miller, was a Civil War deserter who disappeared into the hills with his wife and 2 brothers. They built a ramshackle homestead deep in the hollow and raised a brood that grew wild, angry, and distrustful of outsiders. At first, the Millers were simply strange. They rarely came into town except to trade pelts or buy ammunition. When they did, they spoke little, their eyes darting like hunted animals. Their children were pale, barefoot even in winter, and some claimed they never blinked. But by the 1880s, whispers spread of their cruelty. Farmers who tried to settle near Black Hollow reported their livestock stolen, their barns burned. Hunters claimed to hear gunshots at night, only to find their traps emptied and the ground marked with barefoot prints, too large for a child, too light for a man. Then came the feud. A family named the Harlans bought land near the hollow and built a farmhouse. Within a month, their youngest son was found dead in the woods, his body riddled with bullets from multiple rifles. The Harlans retaliated, firing shots into the trees near the Miller home. What followed was nearly a war. For weeks, gunfire echoed through the valley. Travelers stumbled upon bloody shootouts where bodies lay half buried in leaves. No lawmen dared enter. The Millers killed 2 sheriffs who tried. And then, the Harlans simply vanished. Their house was found abandoned, food still on the table, doors broken open. Some said the Millers slaughtered them all. Others believed the Harlans fled, too terrified to ever return. What no one denied was that from then on Black Hollow belonged to the Millers. The clan grew stranger with each generation. Some believed they married only within the family, their bloodline twisting into something less than human. Hunters who dared venture near their homestead swore they saw figures with elongated limbs, eyes that shone like a wolf's, and movements too quick for the human eye. One story tells of a group of moonshiners who tried to trade with the Millers. Only one returned, and he stumbled into town raving about a den full of things that wore men's skins but weren't men at all. By the 1930s, Black Hollow Road was completely abandoned. Locals said the Millers still lived there, but no one dared see for themselves. Even today, drivers who pass the overgrown road at night sometimes report pale figures watching from the trees. The Millers never left. They simply became the hollow itself. What ties all these families together, the Hatfields, the Wendells, the Griggs, the Millers, and countless others, is not just blood and violence. It's something older. The Appalachians are ancient mountains. Long before settlers, long before cabins and coal mines, the land belonged to peoples who whispered of spirits in the stone, of rivers that demanded offerings, of hollows where the veil between worlds grew thin. When settlers came, they didn't erase those forces. They awoke them. And the families who took root in those cursed places, who spilled blood, who burned, who fed the land with their own cruelty, became part of something far bigger than themselves. Some call it a curse, others call it survival, but the land remembers, and it does not forget. Even now, in the 21st century, these stories haven't died. Hikers vanish without a trace in the hollows where these families once lived. Hunters stumble upon ruins of cabins where the ground still feels warm, or where bones surface after heavy rains. Drivers report pale figures standing at the edge of the road, watching in silence. And genealogists who dig too deep into Appalachian history often hit dead ends. Families that simply disappeared from census records as though swallowed whole. But ask the locals, and they'll tell you, those families never left. The Hatfields, the Wendells, the Griggs, the Millers, blood runs deep in these mountains. And sometimes, when the night is still, it rises again. If you ever find yourself wandering Appalachian backroads, pay attention. If the woods grow too quiet, turn back. If you smell smoke when no fire is burning, leave. And if you see a figure in the tree line, tall, pale, watching, do not call out, do not wave, because out here, family is forever, and some families never die. So tell me, which of these Appalachian families chilled you the most? The fire-fed Wendells, the cannibal Griggs of Deadman's Creek, or the inhuman Millers of Black Hollow? Drop your answer in the comments, because your voice keeps these legends alive. And remember, when you look into the shadows of these ancient mountains, sometimes the shadows look back.